My name is Stephanie Saulter. I'm an author. My first novel, Gemsigns, has just been published, and it's really exciting. Really looking forward to getting the reaction of readers who are not me and my closest friends. The idea, I think what prompted me to write it was having an idea that I couldn't get out of my head. But where that idea came from in the first place, I've never really understood, and I don't know if I ever really will understand. It was an image, it was a moment of inspiration, and it was a sense it was a very strong visual and emotional sense, filled with characters that I didn't understand, and capturing an event that I couldn't comprehend at the time, but it was fascinating. And that happened several years ago, and it prompted a process of trying to understand what I had seen in this flash of inspiration, and trying to understand the characters who were in it and what their motivations would be. And I really had several years of not actually writing anything, but trying to think it through and think back from that moment to understand what had brought these various people to this moment of incredible crisis. I knew that this idea needed to be a novel, and it was the first novel I'd written. I'd always thought that I would like to try writing a novel at some point. I didn't know it was going to be this one. I had, before working on Gemsigns, written a couple of screenplays, and they were similarly strong ideas, but they felt very visual. They felt as though they wanted to be screenplays and that they could not be written in any other form. This one wanted to be a novel, and I don't know any better way to explain it than that, except that that is what it felt like to me. It felt like to try and unravel the characters and the motivations and the plot lines and the backstory, and the complexity of it needed the structure of a novel. It wasn't a purely audiovisual experience in the way that some of the other ideas that wanted to be movie scripts are. This needed the intellectual heft of a novel. It is science fiction in the sense that it is set about 150 years in the future, and set in the aftermath of an apocalyptic moment where the human species and human history has had a complete unraveling, has pivoted around a moment of crisis. And it's describing the aftermath of that, and in some ways the reconstruction of a new society. What occurs not long from where we are now in the early 21st century is a biological crisis that threatens the continuation of the human species. It's discovered that the only way to solve that and to keep ourselves from becoming extinct is to undergo genetic modification on our next generation so that we can survive this illness that is threatening to wipe us out. One of the things I wanted to examine was what makes taboos be overcome, things that we think we would absolutely never permit. Under some circumstances, I think we would permit, and I think if you're looking at your entire species being wiped out, that's one of the things that would change your mind quite rapidly. But of course, things never go quite as planned, and in this scenario, the genetic modification goes beyond simply what's needed to keep people healthy and alive, to the creation of servant classes and servant races almost, who are then for many generations treated incredibly badly in ways that we would not think it was okay to treat other human beings. But what develops in this aftermath of this crisis is that ability to dehumanize others who are different from you, and to think of them as being different creatures, and therefore less deserving of the same consideration. So it takes place over a week, and it takes place over the week in which the central protagonist, a doctor named Eli Walker, is trying to come to his final conclusions about what he is going to present to the body, which is essentially the equivalent of the United Nations now. So it's a very, very big decision he's tasked with. And because he is so important to the whole question, everyone who has a stake in it is trying to influence him. Some of the influences are quite subtle, and some are very violent and very graphic, and are very close to blackmail. he is basically having to decide who he believes and what the evidence supports in all of this tug of war of influences and violence and prejudice that he is trying to navigate through. And in the context of how difficult that is for him, at the same time, in the wider society, all of these issues, all of these prejudices, all of these desires are bubbling up as well. So he's trying to thread a very dangerous course in an environment in which the backdrop, the public mood is changing in quite nasty, quite dangerous ways. It zips along, actually. It zips along. It's structured so that there is each day. Day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 takes you through to the conclusion, and with every day that passes, the crisis grows. I didn't want to write your typically sort of dystopic novel in which it's all grim and it's all terrible and everyone's battling a police state. I wanted to try to capture one of those moments of decision where people become aware that their culture and their society is not developing in a way that they are proud of. And there are individuals at that moment who have to navigate those very difficult channels between a sense of morality, but a sense of also economic practicalities, political realities, as well as their own sense of comfort or discomfort, and come through it to some kind of a new understanding of what it means to be human and what it means to live with people who are not like you, or to decide that you can't live with people who are not like you. It's a thriller. It's quite exciting. There is danger and violence and all of the threat that implies, but underpinning it are some of these really, I think, very difficult questions that we seem to keep on facing throughout history. What makes us human? Is it our genetics, or is it how we treat each other? Is it how we treat each other when we are alike, or is it even more so how we treat each other when we are different? What is that quintessential quality of being a decent human being, and how much of it is in our chromosomes and how much of it is in our behavior? I also wanted to try to unravel something that I find fascinating, but I think is not often portrayed in fiction, and that is the process of thinking through what ends up being policy. We're very good as fiction writers at doing the sort of the car chases and the explosions and the big moments of crisis and violence, and they are what keeps books exciting. We don't often spend the time working through the kinds of decisions that generate those outbursts. And I think they're just as fascinating, and I think they can be just as exciting to read about, depending on how that story is told and what characters are brought forward to tell that story. So at the heart of Gemsigns is a scientist, actually, who is an anthropologist and who's been tasked with trying to determine the truth of all of these various assertions. He's got commercial interests on one side who have a very definite view of what the truth is because it suits their interests. He's got a sort of nervous conservative public on the other. He's got the gems. The name of the book is Gemsigns because the acronym for these severely altered humans, genetically modified humans, are gems. And they, in order for the commercial reasons for which they were created not to ever be mixed up with ordinary humans, are always visibly different. So they will either have an altered anatomy, or they'll have glowing, brightly coloured hair or something. They'll have a gem sign. So they're very clearly marked out. A person who is a gem may be vastly altered, or altered in ways that we would find relatively minimal, but because the stigma of their creation is such that they must always be identifiable. So some gems may have really completely altered anatomy. There's a class of gems called gilungs who've actually been so fundamentally altered that they can exist both on land and in water. They've got the physiques to suit that. They can obviously breathe both types of environment. They've got webbed hands, webbed feet, and glowing green phosphorescent hair. They're clearly very well marked out. There's a character in here called Mikal, who I sort of invented in a moment so that another more major character would have someone to talk to in a particular scene, and he's ended up becoming someone I'm very fond of. He's 8 feet tall, he has 2 thumbs on each hand, and his eyes close in the middle like a lizard, top and bottom, and he's very witty and very funny, and I'm very, very fond of him. He's quintessentially, I think, about what it means to be a gem, because he is so physically different from anyone around him. But what I found writing him was that he is witty and warm and funny and likes to play with words and with language, and is the kind of person who would probably end up working in somewhere very much like where we are now in the Gateway Centre, because he's a community activist and a natural leader and just a lovely guy. But he is 8 foot tall, and he looks like nothing that's ever existed on Earth, because nothing like him ever has existed on Earth. So you start to ask these questions. What does that mean? What is he? And how should he be regarded by others? And he is quite typical, I think, of the dilemma that gems find themselves having in this broader society, and that the broader society has with them. How should they be treated? What's appropriate? Do you consider them to be fundamentally artificial and unequal? Do you consider that they are basically the same but different in the ways that we now understand races to be the same but different? Or is there some third category that we haven't quite developed yet? Conflicts in the book, that's a sort of deep societal conflict, but there are some forces at work that have a very clear sense of what they think about it. One is the commercial interests that created the gems in the first place, who are very clear that they think their properties have been taken away and they're not happy about it. And the other is a fundamentalist religious sect who are very clear that anything that wasn't naturally evolved, so they've now accepted the notion of evolution, but they've got very rigid ideas on what is acceptable evolution and what isn't. Fundamentalists are quite clear that they don't think any of this should ever have been permitted, and there's only one acceptable conclusion for it at this point for them, and that is a central conflict within. I had to do a bit of research, but not as much as you might think, because my background in science, I was going to be a geneticist a very long time ago. I went to Massachusetts Institute of Technology and I studied genetic engineering, and I worked in a lab. So I had the background, and I've always been interested intellectually, and I've always kept up with sort of the big developments in genetic engineering and some of the big ethical debates as well. As I was writing, I had to research specific areas, but a lot of it are things that I tend to think about anyway, about where these sciences might take us. It is essentially about relationships, and it's essentially about a variety of types of relationships, relationships between partners of the opposite sex in the classic way that we would expect, but also relationships between commerce and society, relationships between parents and children. There is a small child at the heart of what happens here, and the sense that deciding who and what he is and what his fate should be is almost sort of the moral heart of the book. So yes, I was very keen to make it about recognizable characters and recognizable people whose motivations were understandable, whichever side of the debate they came down on. So I think it's really important to understand that the people you disagree with also have a point of view and a logic to their point of view, and it's important to understand what that is. My influences are quite broad, but I do feel that there is a public perception that science fiction of being quite narrow, of being very much about space travel and robots and ray guns and sort of being cosmic, very far future adventures, and I've enjoyed a lot of those. One of my favourite science fiction books is Dune by Frank Herbert, but Margaret Atwood is also a favourite of mine, and she's very much on Earth, and she deals with social changes. Ursula Le Guin is also a favourite of mine as well. And of course the classics, some of whom are not necessarily recognised as science fiction, but Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is science fiction in the most pure and grand sense. So my influences are quite diverse, but I'm quite keen to let readers know and to make the point that science fiction isn't just about the technology and the technology in the far reaches of space. It's about how science and technology affects human beings. That's what's really interesting. And if you look at the way our society has changed just in the last 20 or 30 years with the internet and with communications technology, which is not something the masters of science fiction anticipated when they were writing in the 50s, but it's had just as profound an effect as anything they imagined. So I try to think about the things that we might not think are that obvious, but that might really change who we are and the way we behave and the way our society develops. And that's the science fiction I'm really interested in. From when I started properly writing, which was in April of 2011, to when I typed the end on the first draft of the manuscript was about 7 months. I'm very grateful to two of my closest friends, Anne and Alison, because I'd written the first 5 chapters very roughly and in isolation during a hiatus between different bits of work, of paid work. And I wasn't at all sure that I was onto something that was worth continuing. And they read those 5 rough chapters and they said, you need to finish this because we want to know what happens next. So I then took the next 5 months pretty much. I finished the first draft with very little input. I was writing it very much in isolation, which I think works best for me. But then I sent that first draft of the manuscript to a variety of friends, and I intentionally got male, female, old, young, people who read a lot, people who read very little. I wanted a breadth of responses to it, and I got that. It was incredibly generous and helpful. And the responses to that helped me to hone the second draft, and that's the one that went out to agents and publishers. Joe Fletcher Books is a new imprint of Quercus. Quercus is one of the newest and boldest of the major publishing houses, and Joe Fletcher is a veteran of genre publishing. She started a new list within Quercus about 2 years ago to focus on science fiction, fantasy and horror literature. So I'm very, very fortunate. I have a veteran of the industry as my editor and my publisher, but she's still building a small list, so I got a lot of very individual attention, for which I'm very grateful. The publishers, when they read the first draft of Gemsigns, very kindly asked me if I wouldn't mind turning it into the first book of a trilogy, and I said I thought I could probably manage that. So the sequel is called Binary, and it is within touching distance of being finished, and it picks up the story of some of the major characters and some of the big issues of Gemsigns, and it continues them, and it shows how they develop. It's about the dichotomies and the dynamics between the characters and within the society and the way they continue to develop. I'm doing a lot of social media, and my publishers are also doing a lot in terms of promotion. As a new author, I don't have a ready-made audience who are going to rock up to book tours, sadly. Hopefully for the second book that may happen. But at the moment I have been really fortunate. I've been invited to speak on a radio show about books and women's issues in particular in Bristol on the 27th of March. Gemsigns is published in the UK and Commonwealth on the 28th of March. 29th to the 31st I'm at EasterCon, which is the UK's oldest science fiction convention. It's being held in Bradford this year, and I've actually been asked to speak on 3 different panels there, so I'll be talking about the book. Facebook, Twitter, my publisher's blog, my own blog are all going to be talking about it extensively, and then there will be a launch party in London on the 19th of April at the Phoenix Artists Club, to which all of the media will be invited.